introduce myself and give you a bit of a background about who I am and sort of why I'm coming to you here today. Um, my name is Daphne Frias. I'm 22 years old. I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I live in West Harlem, New York. Just to give you perspective of how long my family's been here, my family's lived in the same apartment for 58 years. So we put down roots and we stay for a while. Um, and sort of where I live and where I've grown up has really shaped who I am and my activism to date, which is why I want to share that with you. West Harlem is a amazing amalgamation of primarily Black and Hispanic individuals that immigrated from the Caribbean and surrounding countries. And it's just really created a amazing melting pot for me to grow up and learn about amazing cultures, and I'm really grateful for that. But it also made me privy to a lot of injustices that Black and Brown communities face on a daily basis, and that I personally have experienced for a majority of my life. And um, I just to give a background about sort of like where my activism has started. I was born with cerebral palsy. I was born at 27 weeks. I weighed not a little over 1 ounce. They used to use doctor's masks as my diapers because I was so tiny. My mom loves to tell everyone that story. She thinks it's so cool. And I only had 25% chance of survival, and I had to stay in the NICU for 3 months. So my mom likes to say I've been active since the very beginning, fighting for my life and then fighting for other people's lives. And now that I'm older and stronger, so um, I like to think that like somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I remember that struggle of being a tiny little baby, and that like just pushes me forward and keeps me motivated to just keep pushing for a better world out there. And I've grown up living in a world that's inherently ableist, and that doesn't really create spaces for people with disability to succeed and hold positions of leadership and to just thrive in general. And that was never okay with me. My parents raised me to still be able to do whatever I wanted to do, just a little differently than everybody else. I was that little girl who was zooming around in her wheelchair, zooming around in her walker, crashing things left and right, and just making my presence known as much as I could. And I've stayed that way ever since, and I'm wholly proud of my rambunctious spirit. And it also taught me the privilege of having a voice and um, the the sort of duty that comes with representing a community of people that may not have had a voice for a long time. And as I got older, I realized that I had the unique opportunity to sort of open the door into what it was like to live with a disability and how to sort of navigate higher education, how to navigate living on your own, and sort of teaching people that just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you can't be amazing. And that transitioned into sort of me wanting to fight for everyone. And um, I see myself as a person who every day I wake up and I try to spread a little bit more light than darkness in the world. And I think there's a lot of craziness going on right now. So that really helps keep me motivated and just committed to the cause. And then as I grew through high school and my undergrad career, it was during that time in which I went to a predominantly white institution for undergrad that I realized the power of my voice and sort of the missing piece of representation of my communities of Black and Brown youth in spaces of higher education that are inherently gatekeeping to a lot of minority communities. And it was shortly after the Parkland High School shooting that I got involved in gun violence prevention. Um, I took about 175 students to the nearest march from our undergrad campus. And unfortunately, that day of the march, I ended up getting pneumonia, so I wasn't able to actually physically attend the march, but I still did all of the amazing organizing, and it really showed me that there isn't a prerequisite to creating change or being an activist. All you need is your voice and passion for something uh, that you want to see a difference in. And it was from there that I caught the activism bug, so to speak. And I've been working with March for Our Lives ever since. I finished I just finished up my tenure as New York State Director of March for Our Lives. And during that time, I also progressed in my public health education. And it was during that intersection that I realized that a lot of the social justice issues that I'm fighting for are inherently public health crises and public health issues to begin with. Um, and it's within that understanding that I realized um, there's questions that we face on an everyday basis as a gun violence prevention advocate, like where does gun violence come from and how do we end gun violence? And I think it's about approaching these issues through a public health lens and realizing that violence inherently is its own type of epidemic. And if we can look at violence similarly how infectious diseases spread through our communities, we can have a great chance at ending violence and ending sort of the systemic oppressions that lead to that violence. And a lot of times I get the question like, why, if you're an activist, why are you getting your master's in public health? And it's a question that on the surface to me is frustrating because I always ask myself, why don't more people realize that those two things are intrinsically connected and that they don't necessarily live in silos? And I think it comes down to the fact that if we address the fact that gun violence, the climate crisis, and all the other issues we're facing are systemic issues embedded within our culture, it opens up sort of the conversation to be like, well, why haven't we done anything about them for so long? And that being said, a lot of the work that I do is about working within those intersections and holistically sort of gluing those intersections together so that when we're having conversations about gun violence prevention, it isn't abnormal to also bring up the climate crisis, and it isn't abnormal to bring up LGBTQ plus issues because we all stem from the same systems of oppression. And it's those same systems of oppression that majority Black and Brown communities and young people are facing, and it's coming to the forefront at this current moment in our society. And I think that's why these conversations are so important, especially for those of us who are going into the health field, because um, during my time as a what I like to call a professional patient, dealing with going through my life with a disability, I spent more than 50% of my young life within the hospital, and it led to a myriad of positive experience, but also really negative experiences, where I oftentimes felt like I wasn't anything more than just some words on a chart, and that my disability and my illness sort of equated to all of who I was, and that I wasn't anything more than those things. And it was those negative experiences that that led me to ask, what is the responsibility of our healthcare system to our patients, and like how can we make sure that our medical system is consistently more patient-centered and focused, and less sort of relying on sort of diagnoses and things of that nature, because beyond your diagnosis are real humans with feelings and with emotions that play into the psychological mindset of what it's like to be a patient and what it's like to go through a lengthy healing process. And it was through that I realized that it's inherently the duty of anyone who's going into the healthcare field to be an activist for not just yourself, but for your patients. I think if you're going into the healthcare field and you don't understand the sort of intrinsic layers of oppression that your patients are coming to you with, there is some level of disservice that's being had, because I think a lot of us can attest to the fact that there's so many layers of sort of like trauma that patients can come to us with, especially when we talk about the climate crisis. The climate crisis has, if we think about communities like Flint, Michigan, who for 6 years they were drinking infected tap water, and 7 years since that crisis was unveiled, they still don't have clean drinking water. If the patients that we're treating are being deprived of a sort of intrinsic source of health, they're not going to be focusing on getting a better education. They're not going to be focusing on their school. They're going to be distracted. They're going to be hungry. All of those things play into how the people we treat present to us. And I think that there is a shift that's happening with a lot of with young people today. That Generation Z is really holding up the mantle and saying, it it's time for us to take the lead, and it's time for the adult leaders who really haven't done anything to take a step back, and let us tell you what it is that needs to be done. And I think that same wave of change is hopefully slowly making its way into medicine, where we learn to have a little bit more compassion and a little bit more sort of empathy towards their patients, and their holistic lived experience, and not just the way that they immediately present to us. And I think for me, going into this field is incredibly personal to me in many ways, because there's been so many times where I felt like I was never understood, or if I was going with a family member who primarily spoke Spanish, which is my first language, there weren't translators, or there wasn't a person within my care team that could help my family member understand the scary things that I was going through. And those stories happen quite often, but they're not given sort of the justice that they deserve. And the language you speak or the culture you come from shouldn't be a barrier to your health. We should be able to serve everyone and anyone. And I think we're coming to a time where, because we're in a pandemic, a lot of those questions are starting to be brought up again. How does our healthcare system, does it actually work for the people, and is it made for them to be healthy and to be able to, when you come down with something, feel like you have a reliable place to go to get better. And for a lot of people, that isn't the case. So this discussion for me, I think something that I really want to emphasize is that as we all continue our journeys into our careers, is that being an activist and being a healthcare professional are not two separate entities, that they must and they always must be sort of conjoined, intertwined, because if you aren't on the pulse of what the communities you're serving experience, there is a crucial puzzle piece that you're missing in terms of the way that they needed you to serve them and stand up for them. And it brings me back to this. During one of my speaking tours last year, I actually got to spend a couple of days in Flint, Michigan. I spent about 5 days there, and I toured around different public schools that were in the surrounding area most affected by the water crisis. And many of the students there said that they had no ability to focus on schoolwork. They often went hungry because you need water to prepare a lot of meals that you're cooking. You need water to boil things. You need water to clean your dishes and to clean your pans. And if you were rationing small amounts of bottled water or boiled water, you really had to make a choice between whether you were going to use that water for drinking, or you were going to use that water for cooking. And the kids there, they talked about the increased levels of PTSD and trauma they faced because they just didn't feel like they were in an environment that was safe for them. And this one young girl told me about how her parents actually had her move to another neighboring town to live with her aunt so that she could sort of get away from the crisis and focus a little bit more on school. Um, but even then, she continuously lived the trauma of infected drinking water. Every time her aunt would pour her a glass of drink from the tap, she wouldn't take it, and um, she would usually go into a state of panic, just recalling the level of trauma from her community. Um, and I think it also shows us that sort of why inherently, like why Black and brown communities aren't achieving higher education. Why aren't they going into high level sector jobs? Why aren't they why aren't we having more diverse fields of work? And it stems back to the environments where people grew up, and if they had the resources that they needed to be able to thrive and succeed. And if you're worrying about your daily sort of necessities, you're not going to be able to focus and be able to reach higher levels of education. And it made me realize that as a young Hispanic uh, woman, that I was reaching levels of privilege in my higher education because I was able to graduate from college. I was able to go on to my MPH MD program, and in that it was also my duty to be able to give back to my community, and share the resources and share the knowledge that I learned throughout my higher education experience, and teach my community that the way that we live isn't the way that we should be living. So last year, I actually ran for a elected official position in my community. So my official title is County Committee Woman of West Harlem, and I represent about 735 people. And a major factor of me running for that campaign was that I was tired of people coming into my community and telling us what they thought was best for us, never having lived in the community itself. And my challenger for that position was a woman who lived uh, 3 towns over in a primarily affluent community, and had no sort of grounding or basis as to the people that she was claiming to be able to represent. Um, and throughout the campaign, I realized that there's so much power in community, and that sort of access to healthcare knowledge and access to good healthcare is power and privilege within itself. And there is a reason why we live in a society that systemically works to make sure that Black and brown communities don't have access to those things. Um, and during my first year tenure of this position, I actually instituted a strategy, a public health strategy for my community, in which every month we met, and I educated my community in English and Spanish about public health issues that we were facing in our community. So to give you context about sort of the makeup of my community, we have the largest bus depot for our public health, for our public transportation system here in Manhattan. We also have a water treatment plant. We have one of the biggest on-ramps to one of the largest highway systems in New York City. We have all of these sort of climate-destroying infrastructures within our community that you wouldn't necessarily see in affluent communities, and it sort of highlighted the fact that city planning is systemically prejudiced against Black and brown communities because of the way that these things are disproportionately placed. So through this educational series that I led in my community, I was able to help my community members understand why we have such high rates of asthma and why we have such high rates of diabetes and cholesterol, because we also live in a food desert where access to healthy produce and fresh produce isn't readily available, or if it is available, it's astronomically higher than less healthier foods. And obviously, if you're facing economical hardship, you're going to go for the cheaper options of food for your family. And in educating those people, I was able to see sort of a shift in them and a light bulb turn on. And a lot of them, for the first time in a while, realize that the way that they are living doesn't have to be the way that things are. And through that process, I actually started a letter writing campaign in which I educated my community about how to communicate with your elected officials. So we targeted a specific city council member that had to do with health, equity, and safety. And we all wrote letters to that elected official. We spoke to him about the ability to have open city planning meetings where community members can actually be a part of these meetings and give input as to how infrastructures were being placed. We spoke to him about capping gentrification in our community that was raising prices and putting people out of their homes. And it was during that educational process that I realized even further the link that sort of the link between removing gatekeeping barriers to healthcare and how that can lead to great political and systemic change. And for me, that really solidified sort of creating a space where our healthcare workers are activists. And I actually helped to sort of advise doctors who created the This Is Our Lane campaign on social media in response to gun violence in our country. And for me, that was an incredibly impactful campaign to be a part of, because it lent a new voice to people who are part of this epidemic. As much as it is important to share the voices of victims and communities that are affected by gun violence, it was also incredibly important to hear from the people who are on the front lines of treating our victims of gun violence. And through the creation of that campaign, the This Is Our Lane campaign was able to help pass 20 extreme risk protection order bills across the United States. Extreme risk protection orders give individuals such as teachers, law enforcement, or close family members of a person with a firearm to actually file a petition with the state legislature so that a firearm may be taken away from that person if they are deemed dangerous to themselves or their community. And it's helped save in communities where it's been instated, gun violence has decreased by 35%. And here in New York, it's been about a year. Well, actually, we're coming up on 2 years since the extreme risk protection order was passed here in New York. And this order is actually incredibly influential to curbing intimate partner violence and domestic violence, and issues where a partner is violent towards the other and they may happen to have a firearm. That person or person close to the victim can then report that situation, and those firearms would then be removed from that environment or household, and it's helping to save lives. And I think it's that important shift that saving lives doesn't just happen within the hospital. Saving lives happens in our streets and in our communities, and in places of worship, and at the dinner table, at the lunch table. It happens everywhere. And I think that shift is incredibly important. And it's some of my most rewarding work. It also is a great tool for communicating with your opponents and people that don't agree with you. A lot of my time spent at March for Our Lives was doing lobbying on Capitol Hill for federal bills that worked on gun violence prevention. And oftentimes, being a young person on Capitol Hill, your Congress people didn't necessarily expect you to be knowledgeable on the issues we were fighting for, but being a public health scholar allowed me to understand intrinsically what my communities needed, what they were facing. And I was able to give first-person accounts of the different levels of crises that my communities and the people I was fighting for were facing. And some of the hardest things to oppose are first-person accounts, because you're sort of, instead of being a politician and a constituent, you're two humans exchanging an emotional story. And in moments like that, you sort of see the walls go down just a teeny bit, and that level of resolve gives you sort of the leverage to be able to push for something that you know is going to save lives. And that just goes to say that my public health knowledge has been incredibly invaluable to me in terms of fighting for change and helping to save lives. And it's really my call to all of you to just a huge question I get is, how do you become an activist? What does it take? Is there sort of a magic potion, a perfect set of skills to come together? And the answer really is no. There is no perfect storm. I always say that the beginning of change is by having a conversation. Find a couple groups of friends that believe similar things as you, and ask them, what do they care about? What do they feel? What are things that upsets them? What would they like to see different, and what would they like to see change? And it's through those conversations that you'd often find common ground. And from there, I think a great tool that sort of public health has taught me is about having conversations with your elected officials that go beyond sort of like arbitrary niceties, and it gets down to the root of the conversation and says, here's the community that you represent, but you know nothing about them. And as public health scholars and as healthcare professionals, we can go in with those first-person accounts and say, this is what my community needs from you. And it's also been incredibly helpful in sort of rebalancing our relationship with our elected officials. I think we're in this current moment where oftentimes we forget that our elected officials are actually voted in by us, and they work for us, and the offices and the nice perks they get are paid by our tax dollars. And I think if we can remember that our representatives represent us and that they aren't doing favors, it would take us a long way into seeing change. And I think public health discourse and healthcare knowledge does a lot of justice in helping to rebalance that relationship and that conversation. And for me, I think it's just been, there's been so many times already through my experiences as a doing internships and rotations where I've been the only one on the healthcare team that is able to translate for my patients. I've been the only one on my healthcare team that has been able to relate to someone with a disability and say, well, maybe we should try this sort of route for treatment. Maybe it would work a little bit better for them, because I know what it's like to be on the other side of that conversation, to be the patient in that position. So I think what for me, the moral of the story is, whether you know it or not, every day as healthcare professionals, we are intrinsically activists for our patients and for the communities that we are working in and are fighting for. I think it's also important as we progress further into our healthcare careers, as we move around for residency and for fellowships, as we find ourselves in new communities, that we take the time to learn about those communities, to learn about what their needs are before we arrive there, what the sort of what the makeup is, what are the communities that are hurting the most, and how can we do something about it. A lot of the work I'm doing now is since I'm moving to Baltimore, working with sort of the Baltimore Black and Brown Baltimore community that we saw primarily in the uprising after the murder of Freddie Gray, and now they're having to relive that trauma again with the murder of George Floyd. And it's like 6 years have passed since that first incident. What has changed and what hasn't, and what are the gaps that we can fill? And I think taking the time to be cognizant of the fact that I have knowledge, but I don't necessarily live in that community, and my role isn't to co-opt and to cover the voices of the people who already existed there doing amazing work. My role is to sort of amplify and to support and to give guidance with the knowledge that I'm being able to be afforded in higher education. I think that that's incredibly important, and to hold the institutions accountable that we're all a part of. Universities are huge gentrifiers most times of the communities that they are part of, and very rarely do they actually give back to the communities that they're in, while they benefit off of sort of the people who work there to employ the school and to give staff to the school. But very, very rarely are the schools sort of putting in funding for new parks, for farmers markets, for things that help the community thrive and grow. So something that I've already started working on with other students within Johns Hopkins is to create a youth coalition that every weekend we'll be putting farmers markets right outside of our school, and people can go and get fresh produce, and the leftover produce that doesn't sell will be packaged into grab bags for low-income communities and for homeless individuals that maybe are not able to afford that fresh produce themselves. So we're making sure that the enormous endowments that our universities have and the income that they're making off of our tuition, that it's being put back into those communities. And I think as scholars, as students, that's some of the very least we can do, and it's some of the most rewarding work I've been a part of. And it gives me a little bit more purpose to why I'm in this field. A huge question of mine that I've been having to wrestle with throughout my journey into medicine is, I know that I'm going into a system that intrinsically disservices the communities I'm a part of, that intrinsically silences the voices of people who look like me and who speak like me. And am I being complacent in seeking justice for them by actively putting myself into the system? And it's something that I feel like I'm going to be struggling with for a really long time, and I don't know what that answer is going to look like at the end of the day, but I know that if I at least work to try to sort of balance justice within the system, I know that I've at least done my part to make sure that I'm listening to my communities and the communities I'm serving to say, hey, I'm not just someone sort of in a position of privilege, but I hear you and I see you and I want to do the best by you, and that's really important to me. I think it's the way that we gain trust within our Black and Brown communities. Again, it's the way that we gain trust of minority communities who for so long haven't felt like the healthcare system in this country cares about them. There's people in my family who for years ignored very serious health issues because they didn't feel like they could go to the hospital and have someone who spoke their language, or they were concerned about their undocumented status, or for one reason or another they had bad experiences with healthcare. And I think by sort of reprocessing the way that healthcare workers and healthcare scholars give back to their communities and really listen to the communities they serve, we can work to better repair those relationships and create a system that people feel like they can trust, and that they can find someone who looks like them and who represents them. And it really just gives me purpose, and it makes all the hard days and the long studying worth it, because I know that at the end of the journey, my community is going to have someone who believes in them and who really understands what it is that they need. And I'm grateful to be able to be that representative for them. There's some questions in the chat that I'm just gonna incorporate into this discussion. So first one from Holly are some of the strategies I've used to bring people together and motivate them to act collectively. That's hard because there's a lot of people with a lot of ideas, and that isn't to say that every idea isn't worth listening to, but I think it's about helping people realize that a lot of the ideas that they have sort of a common thread flown through them. And if we can find that one common thread and hone that in to be our target focus, we can actually unite people with different ideas and bring them together in maybe ways that they wouldn't have perceived before. A lot of the work that I do in relation to gun violence prevention is bringing in communities that wouldn't necessarily communicate with each other. So I always urge, have uncomfortable conversations, because it's at the edge of uncomfortability where change happens. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not doing something enough. So an example of this is when I was an undergrad, I had this radical idea to actually bring in some NRA members to speak at our campus, and we had a panel with March for Our Lives scholars and the NRA, and everybody's like, "This is the craziest thing ever. You're gonna put everyone in danger. The school's gonna expel you." Like, it was this whole really dramatic thing. And I was like, "No, guys, like, I think this is so good. Like, I think this is what we need to be doing." Because it's like, if we stay in our polarized corners, we're never gonna reach a common ground where change can actually occur. So I don't know how I did it, but like somehow the school let me actually bring like 4 of these NRA members to campus, and we had like tons of security. Like, you would have thought that the president was coming to school. It was crazy. And we had an hour and a half long discussion moderated by my school's counseling center. And obviously we weren't gonna walk away from that conversation being best friends, but at the end of that conversation, I was able to see that so much of the anger and so much of the sort of opposition of a lot of NRA members is simply a lack of education and a lack of knowledge of what gun violence prevention activists actually stand for. We're not trying to like repeal the Second Amendment, even though that's what everyone says. Like, that's really not what we're trying to do. We're trying to just live our lives and be safe. And actually, out of that conversation, the leader of the upstate chapter of the NRA, I think actually it was a Syracuse chapter, invited me to one of their local meetings. And my mom was like terrified. She's like, "You're absolutely not going to this meeting. Like, there's no way. Like, you're not gonna come back from this meeting. Like, it's gonna be bad." And I was like, "Mom, no. Like, I think this is like super important. I think like maybe I can get some good ground." So the 2 things I went presenting to the NRA was what I explained briefly before, the extremist protection orders, and then also the HR 8, which is the House reform bill for universal background checks. And I presented about how universal background checks wouldn't affect you if you're a law-abiding citizen and gun owner and have no form of a criminal record, if you use firearms to hunt, or if you feel like you need them for safety. If you have no reason to be suspicious, this bill would not affect you. And 90, I believe it's 97% of gun owners wouldn't be affected by this bill whatsoever. I explained to them how extremist protection orders are for the safety of others, and it also is an incredibly important tool in curbing suicide, which is something that is often not discussed in the gun violence prevention space, that suicide is gun violence, and we need to be making sure that people who are emotionally distressed don't have access to firearms for their safety. And again, we weren't walking out of the meeting being best friends, but a couple of the members of that chapter actually came up to me and said, like, hey, I don't hate you as much as I did like 4 days ago. And like, I felt like I won the Oscar. I was like, yes, I can quit activism. Like, it's good. I did it. I saved everything. And like, it was the best feeling ever. And it's like, if I wouldn't have pushed to have that conversation, I would have never had that breakthrough. And till this day, those three men have been like some of my biggest supporters, and they go around to other NRA groups and like give the same presentation that I gave to them. And I actually testified before Congress about why HR should be passed, and I said this exact same story before Congress and said, you want Americans to be polarized and you want us to fear each other, but actually if you allow us to have conversations that bring us together and stop using your money to purport millions of ads all over the TV that fearmonger people, maybe we would actually reach a resolution. Congress was not very pleased with my speech, but it was to show that like common ground is achievable and it isn't unheard of. And yeah, you're gonna have to put yourself in some scary situations, but something worth fighting for is never not scary. And I think, so I guess that was a long way to say, push yourself to be uncomfortable, and push yourself to have conversations with people who you necessarily wouldn't consider allies, because you may find out that at the end of the day, those are some of your strongest allies and supporters. One second, let me just pull up the chat here again. So, oh, so it was specifically about med school. I guess I didn't really specifically say. So I'm an incoming MS1 student. I'm in a dual degree program for my MPH and MD at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also going to be a teaching fellow at the Gun Violence Prevention Center at Johns Hopkins, which is the only school dedicated to gun violence prevention research in the United States. So it is really an amazing combination between two areas that I love. And I'm incredibly lucky to be able to have found sort of a perfect mix of those things. I would love to go into neurology and work more on creating equitable approaches to cerebral palsy and other neurological disorders. There is a lot of research happening as it relates to pediatric cerebral palsy patients, but there isn't sort of a lot of research happening on continual care after the age of 18, which is currently where I'm at. And being a patient in that space has been incredibly difficult. And if I can work to bring more equity and awareness on that, I would love to be able to do that. I also, my big dream goal at the end of the rainbow is to become the head of the CDC, but that's a whole other thing because the CDC is a hot mess. And every day my mom yells at me like, see, this is why you just need to get in there, because they don't know what they're doing. I was like, I know, Mom. So that's my big dream goal. But that being said, it's just finding ways through this path that I can be authentically sort of true to myself and the experiences that I've lived, and that I use the knowledge as a patient to better advocate for my people and my community. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the ADA at the end of this month. And while a lot has happened, a lot hasn't. COVID has sort of breached a gaping hole into accessibility and how quickly universities were able to turn to virtual learning, but how many of us with disabilities have often requested virtual learning and accommodations with learning. Schools most often deny those requests. So it makes no sense to me how universities were able to turn virtually within a couple of weeks for thousands of students, but when one or two students with documented needs and needs for accommodation asked for those similar changes were not being met with sort of equity and believability. So there is a lot to be done in that space. So this question is, what lessons from working as a representative of your community do you think you'll take with you as you become a physician advocate? I think the one thing I will definitely take with me is letting my patients teach me and let me know what they need. Instead of sort of jumping the gun and maybe superimposing treatments and ideas, to tell me whether it's sort of non-verbally or verbally what you need and how I can help you. I truly believe that the job of a physician isn't necessarily to take over and control the steering wheel in a person's health. It's to be a guiding force and a guiding sort of hand throughout the whole thing, so that they feel safe and they feel your patient feels understood and listened to through the whole process. So I hope that I can always remember what it feels like to be a patient, and that I always remember those times of injustices that I had to experience, and that I work hard to make sure that no patient of mine ever experiences that, and the teams that I work with, that they are equitable and just, and sort of work to uphold the highest standard of patient care and empathy. So fingers crossed, I can keep my moral compass straight. So oh, of course, Maddie, you had to ask the question about balance, because you know that I fail at balance. So I think it's, well, if I'm being completely candid, I have no idea what balance is. I need to look at a dictionary and refigure it out, because it's not working. But I think it's about sort of readjusting my relationship with self-care, and realizing that self-care isn't you shouldn't feel guilty about taking time for self-care. I think especially as medical students, who can be very altruistic and empathetic and feel like we have to put so much of ourselves into everything all the time. And something my mom always says is like, you can't give anything to others if you don't have anything for yourself. And I always try to remember her words and remind myself that I'm only the best advocate, ally, friend, sister, daughter, if I replenish myself and replenish my light. And I can only work for my communities as best as I'm able to work for myself. So sort of tying my own self-care into my ability to be able to function for my community, I think creating that symbiotic relationship that, like, hey, Daphne, if you're a literal zombie and you've only slept 1 hour, you're gonna suck at making that speech in like 5 hours. You're not gonna be able to like coherently do that well. So sort of just tying my self-care and my re-energizing to my ability to be able to show up and be there for my community, that's really helped me. I also do this weird thing where like I write myself a letter at the beginning of the month of like what I want to accomplish, whether it be for work, personally, or other things I'm doing, and then I have it auto send to myself at the end of the month, so I can read what I wrote at the beginning of the month and see like how far I've come and if I've been able to reach those goals. And it just serves as like a personal reflection point for me. And it isn't something that like, oh, if I don't meet a goal that I wrote in the beginning, that I am hard on myself on it. It's like, okay, I'm just going to shift to the next month and I'm going to give myself the time that I need to be able to accomplish that goal. And I think that point of reflection is really important. Staying wholly committed and accountable to my communities and the people that I serve is incredibly important to me. And anytime that I feel like I'm losing that connection or that pull, I have like a vision board of like all these pictures of my community, all the places that I used to love going as a kid in my community. And it just reminds me about the beautifulness that exists here and the beautifulness of the people that I surround myself with. And it just helps to ground myself. So just finding ways that you feel sort of replenish yourself and allow you to be like wholly authentic and reflective. I think that is some of the best ways. I try, and try is the operative word there. Try to find balance but it's a work in progress. And I think if you feel like you're out of balance, the worst thing to do is to be hard on yourself. Just Maddie and I were talking about this before. We're just trying our best, and if you give your best every single day, that's all that you can ask of yourself. And you deserve to give yourself a pat on the back every once in a while. You deserve to tell yourself that you're awesome. And this is just me vicariously living through my Pinterest board of quotes that like help my self-motivation. But that all goes to say that it's okay. We're all a work in progress, and especially now are really trying and strange times. So just to be kind with yourself and patient. Um, um, I think I think this is a question for you more, Maddie, about how to get involved with AMSA.
Yes, yeah. So I am going to email her, so we talked separately.
Okay, perfect.
And I think we are out of questions at this point. And we are almost at the top of the hour, so this was perfect. If anybody has any other questions or wants to stay behind to talk to Daphne, we have 4 minutes.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank you, and I don't know if you had any closing words that you wanted to say.
Yeah, I hope this was helpful. It was a really long ramble of my consciousness, but I hope that there was some gems in there that you were able to grab and hold on to. And I'm also like the most easily able to find person on the internet. I have like no levels of privacy. It's really bad. So feel free to find me on my social media to continue any conversations, whether it be in the immediate future or way down the line. I'm so happy to continue these conversations, and I'm just happy to be in community with you all. So yeah, if you have any other questions now or later, feel free to ask.
So thank you so much, Daphne, for spending your time and sharing your story with us this evening. I think that everyone can agree that your story brings so much light to this world. And absolutely mind-blowing how much work that you've done so far, and can't wait to see what else you do. Just as you said, people can find you on social media, and also you have an amazing webpage that people can follow through with. And I think at this point we are all set. We'll be sending out just a follow-up email with an actual action that anyone can participate in. It's specifically calling Congress in support of the HEROES Act, which is currently waiting to be reviewed by the Senate. So we'll send that out to y'all probably around tomorrow. Oh, and Daphne, do you want to put in your website?
Yeah, I'm gonna put in the link right now.
Awesome.
And oops, I sent it too early. And I just updated it last night, right before I knew I was gonna do this. I was like, oh, let me make it look cute for all the people who might want to see it.
Awesome.
So, it's